Every man in Frost Creek knew one rule about Caleb Rowan. He never went east, not for anyone. But for 11 consecutive Wednesdays, the most respected man in town walked the wrong direction through the dark, and nobody could figure out why. Some said he owed a debt, some said he'd lost his mind. The women at the general store had a different theory, and they weren't keeping it quiet. What nobody understood yet was that a quiet man walking the wrong road was about to change everything about the town that thought it already knew him. If this story already has you curious, hit that like button, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this journey travels. Now settle in. This one's going to take a while. The mill whistle blew at 5:30 every morning without fail, and Frost Creek organized its entire existence around that sound. Farmers timed their breakfast to it. Children rolled out of bed when they heard it echoing off the mountain face. Old Doris Pelham, who ran the boarding house on Callaway Street, claimed she hadn't used a clock in 14 years because the mill whistle was more reliable than anything manufactured in the East. It wasn't just a sound, it was the town's heartbeat. And the man who kept that heartbeat steady, who made sure the boiler pressure held and the blades stayed sharp and the timber came down on schedule, was Caleb Rowan. He was 34 years old and looked closer to 40 in poor light. Not because he was worn down exactly, but because he had one of those faces that had never quite been young. His jaw was heavy, his hands were rough in the way that spoke of real use rather than performance, and his eyes were the pale gray-green of river water in November. He didn't say much. The men who worked under him had learned early that silence from Caleb meant he was thinking, and thinking from Caleb usually meant something was about to get solved before it became a problem. He'd been foreman at Frost Creek Mill for 6 years. Before that, he'd worked the floor for 4 more. A decade in the same building, breathing the same sawdust, answering to the same owners, first to old Gerald Ashby, and then for the last 2 years to nobody in particular, because Gerald had died of a heart attack on a Tuesday afternoon in June and left the whole operation to his daughter Nora, who was 22 years old, had spent most of her life in a boarding school in Portland, and had never once set foot inside a sawmill. That particular problem was the one Caleb was still working on solving when the second problem arrived on a Wednesday morning in early October, stepping off the supply wagon with a worn leather suitcase and a piece of paper folded into thirds. But her name was Iris Holloway. She was perhaps 26, perhaps 28. It was genuinely difficult to tell. She had the kind of face that gave nothing away for free, dark eyes that moved quickly and cataloged everything they landed on, and dark hair pinned up with the practical severity of someone who'd learned long ago that looking neat was easier than explaining why you didn't. She wore a gray coat that had been good quality once, maybe 3 years ago. The suitcase had a crack along one corner held together with what appeared to be a length of thin rope. She walked up to the mill's front office and knocked on the frame of the open door, even though Caleb was standing right there and could obviously see her coming. "I'm looking for the hiring manager," she said. Caleb was holding a clipboard and didn't look up from it immediately. "That'd be Miss Ashby. She's not in yet. The employment letter says to report to a Mr. Harlan. Harlan retired in August." A pause. Oh, he did look up then. She was standing very straight, which he noticed, and her expression was carefully neutral in a way that suggested she was working at it. "You have an employment letter from Harlan?" he asked. "From Mr. Gerald Ashby, countersigned by Harlan, for a bookkeeping position." She unfolded the paper and held it out. "I understand Mr. Ashby passed away. I wasn't certain the position would still exist, but I didn't have money to wire ahead and ask, so I came." Caleb set down the clipboard and took the letter. He read it twice. It was genuine. He knew Gerald's handwriting well, had seen it on 100 documents, and the signature at the bottom was unmistakably the old man's cramped, leftward-leaning scrawl. The date was 8 months old. Gerald had hired this woman for a position that everyone in the building had since forgotten existed. "You traveled here on a letter from a dead man," he said. "It wasn't an accusation. It was just what had happened. I traveled here on a legitimate employment contract," she said, and there was just the faintest edge under it. "Whether or not the man who wrote it is still living doesn't change what it says." He handed it back. "No, I suppose it doesn't." He told her to wait and went to find Nora Ashby. But Nora had arrived at the mill 40 minutes earlier and was already in over her head, which was her standard condition. She was sitting at her father's enormous oak desk, surrounded by ledgers she didn't understand, wearing an expression that walked the line between determined and genuinely frightened. She had her father's coloring, fair-skinned, reddish-brown hair, but not his easy confidence, and the 6 months since his death had carved something careful and tight into the corners of her mouth. Caleb knocked and stepped in without waiting. He'd learned early that waiting for Nora to collect herself could take the better part of a morning. "There's a woman in the front office with a hiring letter your father signed in February. Bookkeeper." Nora looked up. "A what?" "Bookkeeper. Your father apparently arranged for one before he died and then apparently didn't mention it to anyone." We already have Simmons doing the accounts." "Simmons does the floor accounts. Weekly wages, supply orders, that kind. Your father's letter specifies a full ledger bookkeeper, someone to manage the operating accounts, the contracts, the long record." Caleb paused. "Which, if I'm being direct, are currently a mess." Nora's jaw tightened. "I'm aware they're a mess, Caleb. I'm working on I'm not criticizing. I'm saying your father saw this coming and hired someone. She's standing in the hallway. You might want to talk to her." Nora stood, smoothed her skirt, and adopted the expression of a young woman trying to appear like she knew what she was doing. Caleb had seen her practice it. He found it more affecting than she realized, that particular bravery. The performance of competence when you were terrified. He'd done it himself once. He remembered what it cost. He brought Nora to the front office, introduced the two women to each other with minimum ceremony, and excused himself to go deal with a problem on the floor involving a jammed intake gear and two men having an argument about whose fault it was. He thought that would be the end of his involvement with Iris Holloway. He was wrong about that. She was still there at the end of the day. Nora had hired her on the spot, more out of desperation than confidence, Caleb suspected, and Iris had spent the intervening 8 hours in the small back office next to the filing room, doing what appeared to be a systematic inventory of every financial document the mill had generated in the past 2 years. When Caleb passed the doorway at 4:30, she was sitting on the floor with folders spread around her in a pattern that looked chaotic from the outside, but clearly made sense to her, her coat off, her sleeves rolled up, pencil tucked behind one ear, and another one in her hand, moving through columns of numbers with the focused intensity of someone diffusing something. He didn't speak to her. There was nothing to say, and she wasn't looking up anyway. The second time he passed, 20 minutes later, she'd moved to the desk and was writing in a ledger with long, rapid strokes. The pencil scratched steadily. Outside, the mill was quieting down for the evening, men collecting their jackets, the machinery going still one piece at a time. He went to get his own coat and his hat and came back through the corridor on the way out. She was still there. "The building locks at 6, he said, pausing in the doorway. She didn't look up. "I know, Miss Ashby told me. I'll be done before then." "You eaten anything today?" That made her look up. The question had surprised her. It surprised him a little too. He wasn't sure where it had come from. "I had breakfast," she said. "That was 10 hours ago." "I'm aware." She went back to the ledger. "I'll eat at the boarding house." "Good evening, Mr. Rowan." He stood there 1 second longer than was natural, which he noticed and which he put a stop to by walking out the door. The boarding house was on Callaway Street, which ran east through the older part of town before curving north toward the mountain road. Caleb's own place, a small cabin he'd built himself over 2 summers, with a wood stove that worked better than it looked, and a porch that still needed railings, was west of the mill, past the old timber yard, a 15-minute walk in good weather. He went west, as he always did. That was the first Wednesday. The second Wednesday happened because of a coincidence that wasn't quite a coincidence. He was locking the mill's side gate when he saw her come out the front door. It was nearly dark, October dark, the kind that fell fast and had teeth in it. And she was walking east alone, her suitcase presumably at the boarding house already, just her coat and her hat and the narrow beam of light from the one working street lamp 50 yards away. Frost Creek was not a dangerous town, but it was a frontier town, which meant its safety was conditional on circumstances and timing in ways that an eastern city girl might not have calibrated yet. There were logging camps 3 miles out that sent men into town on weeknights. There was a saloon at the east end of Callaway that closed when it felt like it. The road between the mill and the boarding house was poorly lit and ran along the back of 3 warehouses for a quarter mile. He told himself this was why he turned east instead of west. He caught up with her before she reached the first warehouse. "I'll walk with you," he said. He said it the way you'd state a fact. The sky is gray. It will snow before Friday. I'll walk with you. She glanced sideways at him. That's out of your way. A bit. Mr. Rowan, you don't need to. I know I don't need to. He kept walking. I'm going to anyway. She was quiet for a moment. Then she fell into step beside him, and they walked the rest of the way to the boarding house without speaking more than another dozen words. He said good night at the door. She said thank you in a tone that was careful and self-contained. He walked back through the dark alone, went west past the old timber yard, and got home 40 minutes later than usual. He told himself it was a one-time thing. It became a thing. Not every day. She could manage the daytime walk on her own, and she clearly had no interest in being managed. But Wednesday evenings, when the work ran long and the dark came early, and the road between the mill and Calloway Street had that particular quality of being both empty and threatening, he was there. He didn't make an announcement about it. He didn't ask her permission after the first time. He was simply present at the side gate when she came out, and they walked east together. She didn't thank him again after the second time. He didn't bring it up. They talked about the mill, mostly. The account she was working through, problems she'd found in the supply ordering, a discrepancy in the lumber contract records from 18 months back that she thought explained a chunk of the operating deficit nobody had been able to account for. There are 3 separate billing codes for the Halverson contract, she told him on the 4th Wednesday, their breath visible in the cold air. 2 of them are legitimate. The 3rd one doesn't correspond to any actual supply order I can find. It's been applied quarterly for 2 years. Caleb frowned. How much? Over 2 years? Close to $800. He was quiet for several steps. $800 was serious money, more than 3 months of full payroll. You think it's an error? I think it's deliberate, she said, and her voice was flat and precise. An error this consistent over this many billing cycles isn't an error. Someone was skimming, and they were careful about it. Small enough amounts per quarter that nobody running a casual review would catch it. But you caught it. I'm not running a casual review. She paused at the boarding house door. I need access to the Halverson original contract files. They should be in the east storage cabinet in your office. Do you have the key? I'll get you the key tomorrow. She nodded. Good night, Mr. Rowan. Caleb, he said. It came out before he'd fully decided to say it. She looked at him. I'm sorry? Caleb, my name. We've walked this road 4 times now. Something shifted slightly in her expression. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. Good night, Caleb. He walked home through the dark alone, and the walk felt shorter than it usually did. By the 6th Wednesday, the town had noticed. Frost Creek was not a large town. It had perhaps 400 permanent residents, a number that swelled in summer with logging season workers and shrank in winter when the passes closed and anyone with options used them. 400 people in a mountain settlement meant that privacy was something you negotiated rather than assumed, and that the sight of the mill foreman, a man known for going home directly and speaking to people only when something needed to be said, repeatedly walking east when he lived west, was the kind of deviation that got talked about. The first person to say something to Caleb directly was Pete Dawes, who worked the floor and had a gift for speaking out loud what everyone else was thinking. You courting that bookkeeper woman? He asked one morning, without preamble, while they were both looking at a tension problem in the main saw housing. Caleb kept his eyes on the housing. Hand me the wrench. Because people are saying, but I don't need to know what people are saying. Hand me the wrench, Pete. Pete handed over the wrench. She's not from here. That's all I'm saying. I know she's not from here. She came off the supply wagon with a suitcase. Nobody missed that. Well, Pete shuffled his boots on the sawdust floor. I just thought you should know there's talk. There's always talk. Caleb tightened the housing bolt and straightened up. Check the tension on that secondary blade before the afternoon run. He walked away before Pete could decide whether he'd been dismissed or not. But the truth was he heard it everywhere now, once he knew to listen for it. At the general store, a conversation that stopped a beat too late when he walked in. At the foreman's table during the midday break, a certain studied casualness from men who'd been discussing him 30 seconds earlier. Doris Pelham, who ran the boarding house and was constitutionally incapable of minding her own business, had apparently been speculating extensively to anyone who'd listen about whether Iris Holloway was going to end up heartbroken or merely embarrassed. He didn't like it, not for his own sake particularly, but because he could see the edges of it reaching Iris. She was smart enough to know she was being watched, and smart enough to understand what the watching meant. The frontier had its own particular cruelty toward women who accepted kindness from men they weren't married to, especially women who'd arrived from somewhere else and hadn't yet earned the town's baseline goodwill. He saw the effect of it on a Thursday, the day after their 6th walk. She came into the mill looking the same as always, neat, focused, professionally contained, but there was something compressed about her jaw that hadn't been there before. She went to her office and closed the door, which she never did. When he knocked and opened it an hour later to give her the shipping log she'd asked for, she had the specific stillness of someone who'd recently been having a hard time and had put it away. "You heard something," he said. It wasn't a question. She took the shipping log from him without meeting his eyes. Mrs. Pelham expressed some concerns this morning about the impression being given. What kind of concerns? The usual kind. Her voice was very steady. The kind that suggests a woman in my position ought to be more careful about accepting favors, since favors from men like yourself generally come with expectations attached. The anger was quick and cold, and he kept it off his face. She said that to you. More or less, she was very kind about it. Iris set the log on the desk and opened it. I don't hold it against her. She's looking out for her boarder in the way she knows how. She was wrong to say it. She may be wrong and still be giving useful advice. Iris's eyes moved across the log's columns with practiced speed. These walks, Caleb, I appreciate them, I do. But if they're going to cause, if the town is going to... She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. I can manage the road on my own. I always have. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her. This woman who had come to a strange town on a dead man's letter with $40 to her name, who had found fraud in the accounts inside 2 weeks, who sat on the floor with ledgers spread around her and worked through the dinner hour, and came back the next morning without complaint, who was currently preparing to sacrifice the one predictable piece of human consideration she'd been offered because the town had decided to make it uncomfortable. You shouldn't have to manage it on your own, he said. She looked up then, just for a second. Good night, Iris, he said, and left before she could tell him to stop coming. He was there at the side gate the following Wednesday. She came out the door and stopped when she saw him. She looked at him for a long moment with that dark, quick, cataloging gaze of hers. Then she came down the steps and fell into step beside him. Neither of them mentioned it. The fraud was bigger than Iris had first thought. She brought her findings to Nora on a Friday morning in late October, spreading 3 weeks of documentation across the oak desk in a precise arrangement that told the story simply enough that even someone with no accounting background could follow it. Nora listened. She asked 2 good questions. Then she sat back in her father's chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Harlan, she finally said. Yes. My father trusted him. I know. Iris's voice was careful. I'm sorry, Miss Ashby. He worked here for 16 years. Nora pressed her fingers against her mouth. $800. $840. The final quarterly application came through in September, which was 2 months after he retired. I believe that was either a scheduled automatic billing that he forgot to cancel when he left, or he took the risk that no one would notice given the change in management. He didn't expect me to hire an actual bookkeeper. No, I don't think he did. Nora was quiet. Then, with the careful dignity of someone who'd had to get good at controlling her feelings in public, she straightened up and folded her hands on the desk. What do I need to do? I can prepare documentation for a legal recovery claim. The Halverson account can be reclassified and the billing code flagged. That stops any future automatic applications. The $840 is recoverable, but it will require involving the county magistrate. Do it. Nora's voice had gone quiet in a particular way that Caleb, watching from the doorway where he'd come to listen and hadn't been told to leave, recognized as the sound of someone finding out they're tougher than they thought. He caught Iris's eye as she gathered her documents from the desk. She gave him a look that was brief and direct, and he understood it to mean, I told you it was deliberate. He gave her a small nod that meant, yes, you did. It was, in retrospect, the longest conversation they'd had, without using a single word. The recovery of the $840 did not make Iris popular with the creditor class of Frost Creek. This surprised her the first time she felt it, the specific chill from the two men who showed up to renegotiate the Halverson contract after the billing fraud came to light. They were polite to Nora with the easy, slightly condescending courtesy of men who'd been dealing with the Ashby family for years and had a certain expectation of how the dynamic worked. They were something else to Iris, not quite rude, but calibrated, measuring. One of them, a heavy-set man named Graves, who represented the Halverson lumber interests, had the particular quality of smiling while looking at you like a problem to be solved. "You're the new bookkeeper," he said to her, in a tone that suggested he found this amusing. "Yes." She had the contract documents in front of her and didn't look up. "Young for that kind of work." "I'm competent for it. That matters more than the other thing." She turned a page. "The reclassified billing schedule is here and here. The section you'll want to review is on page 4. Graves looked at Nora instead of at Iris. "Miss Ashby, is it typical for your staff to—" "Miss Holloway is handling the contract review," Nora said. Her voice was steady, and Caleb, who was standing against the wall with his arms crossed, felt something like pride for her. "If you have questions about the documents, you should address them to her." Graves turned back to Iris. He studied her for a moment with the specific expression of a man deciding how much resistance is worth his time. "Page 4, he said finally. "Page 4, Iris confirmed, and slid the document across the desk. After they left, having signed the reclassified schedule, reluctantly, because the numbers were correct and indisputable, Nora let out a slow breath. "Well," she said. "They'll come back in better humor," Iris said, already gathering the documents. "They're not happy, but they understand the terms. Give them until spring." "Were you nervous?" Nora asked. It was a genuine question, from someone who'd been nervous and trying not to show it. Iris considered this. A little, not about them specifically, just about being new enough that they could decide not to take me seriously. She paused. "I've been in those rooms before. You learn to hold very still and not let them see it. Does it get easier? Some things do. Some things you just get better at hiding." Iris looked at her with a directness that wasn't unkind. "You did well, Miss Ashby. You held your ground." Nora blinked. It seemed she hadn't expected to be told that. "I just followed your lead. That's what good management does. You'll know when to set the pace yourself. It won't be long." Caleb left the room without saying anything, because anything he might have said would have been inadequate. But he stood in the corridor for a moment with his hand on the doorframe and thought about the woman inside, who had come here with nothing, who had been doubted from the first hour, who had found the fraud and built the case and held the room, and was now quietly teaching a young heiress how to run a business. And he thought that whatever it was he was feeling, it had been growing for longer than he'd acknowledged. He walked back to the floor and kept his mouth shut about it. November came in hard. The first real snow hit Frost Creek on a Saturday, the kind that arrived without much warning and left 6 inches on the ground by morning. By the following Wednesday, the temperature had dropped enough that the mill equipment needed an extra 30 minutes of warm-up before operation, and the road between the mill and Callaway Street was tracked with ice under the snow that made every step a negotiation. Caleb was waiting at the side gate, as usual. Iris came out wearing the same gray coat, which was not heavy enough for November in the mountains, and he noticed immediately that she was cold, not shivering yet, but moving with the particular tightness of someone whose body was already pulling heat inward. "Your coat," he said. "Good evening, Caleb." She came down the steps. "It's not enough coat. I'm aware." Her tone was the one that meant, "I know. I can't do anything about it right now. Please don't make it worse by elaborating." He'd learned to read that tone. He'd stopped pushing when he heard it, mostly. He fell into step beside her. They walked east. The snow muffled the sounds of the town, and their breath showed white in the lamplight. "The Halverson documents went to the magistrate yesterday," she said. "I heard. Nora wants to use the recovered funds to repair the East Wing drying shed. She asked my opinion." A pause. "I told her it was the right call. The shed repair affects productivity in January and February, which affects the spring contract fulfillment, which is the backbone of the operating budget for the whole year." "She listened to you?" "She's been listening to me for a week now. I think it surprised both of us." Another pause, longer. She's not who I expected when I came here." "Who did you expect?" Iris was quiet for a moment. Their boots crunched on the packed snow. "Someone easier to write off," she said finally. "A girl playing at business until she sells and goes home. I was prepared for that. She's not that." "No," Caleb agreed. "She's not. She's going to be good at this if she lets herself be." "She will be, with the right help." He didn't look at Iris when he said it. He was looking at the road ahead, but he felt her glance at him in the sideways way she had, quick and assessing, and then look forward again. They reached the boarding house. He said goodnight. She said goodnight. He walked west through the cold and the dark and thought about the word help and all the things a person could mean by it. He fixed her desk on a Sunday when she wasn't there. He'd noticed it 3 weeks earlier, the way she kept her left hand slightly turned when she wrote, which was wrong. It had taken him a few days to figure out why, and then on a Thursday when he'd been in the filing room next door, he'd looked through the open doorway and seen the edge of the desk more clearly. The right side corner of the surface had a rough split in the wood, old and not cleaned up properly, with a raised grain that would catch and drag on the heel of a hand. She was right-handed, so she wouldn't have noticed. But the position she sat in, turned slightly toward the filing cabinet, meant her left wrist rested on that corner regularly, and the rough wood was wearing at her skin in a way that she had apparently decided not to mention to anyone. He went in on Sunday with a block plane and some fine sandpaper in 40 minutes, smoothed the split, dressed the edge, applied a thin coat of linseed oil to the whole surface, and let it soak in. Moved everything back exactly as he'd found it. He'd paid attention to the arrangement before touching anything, which had required more attention than he was strictly comfortable admitting. He was gone before noon. Monday morning, she sat down at the desk and ran her hand across the surface. He was passing the doorway and saw it. The brief pause, the slight frown, the moment of realizing something had changed. She looked up at the doorway and found him there. "You did this," she said. "Surface needed dressing." "Caleb?" Her voice had something in it he couldn't entirely name. "It was catching on your wrist," he said simply. "I could see it from the other room." She looked at him for a moment that ran a beat longer than usual. Then she said quietly, "Thank you," and looked back down at her work. He went on to the floor. He didn't think about it for the rest of the day, or at least he tried not to, with the particular effort of a man who has gotten very good at not thinking about things that are better left unexamined. The Wednesday after Thanksgiving, a holiday they all worked through because the mill didn't pause for holidays unless the weather made the equipment unsafe. Iris was the last out of the building again, and Caleb was at the gate again, and they walked east as they always did. They were a block from the boarding house when she said, without particular lead-up, "Mrs. Pelham told me this morning that you're wasting your time." Caleb kept walking. "Wasting it how?" "She says men like you," her words, "eventually come to their senses and settle with someone appropriate. She seems to have a candidate in mind, the younger Hartley daughter." "Margaret Hartley is 17 years old." "I mentioned that. She said 17 was plenty old enough to be thinking about it." Iris's voice was very even. She wasn't trying to be unkind. She's genuinely trying to prepare me for something she considers inevitable. He stopped walking. She stopped a step later and turned to look at him. "Is that what you think?" he said. His voice came out lower than intended, quieter. "That I'm passing time." Her chin came up slightly in the way it did when she was being careful. "I think you're a good man who does good things because that's who you are. I don't think it means anything beyond that. You've decided that. It's the sensible thing to think." "Iris." He said her name the way you say something when you want someone to actually stop and hear it. "I don't know what you think is happening here, but I want you to know it's not nothing, to me. These walks aren't nothing." She looked at him in the lamplight, the snow coming down lightly now, settling on her coat. Her expression did the thing it did when she was working through something. The slight tension in her brow, the calculation behind her eyes. He'd watched her use that expression on a column of fraudulent numbers. He didn't particularly enjoy being looked at the same way. "What is it then?" she said. Quiet, honest, the kind of question that was brave because it could get an answer you didn't want. He opened his mouth, and across the street, the saloon door banged open and 3 men from the night logging crew stumbled out, loud and laughing, and the moment broke apart. She stepped back. He straightened. One of the loggers called something across the street that wasn't quite rude enough to require a response, and they both chose not to give one. They walked the last half block to the boarding house in silence. "Good night," she said at the door. "Good night," he said. He walked west through the snow. He got halfway to the old timber yard and stopped and stood in the dark for a moment with his hands in his coat pockets, looking up at nothing in particular. He had not answered her question. He had not answered it because he was afraid that whatever answer he gave would be the wrong one. Too much, too soon, presumptuous. She had come here with a cracked suitcase and a dead man's letter and had spent every day since proving that she didn't need anyone to carry her through the door. The last thing she needed was a man who was going to add to the list of things she had to navigate. He told himself that was why. He walked the rest of the way home through the dark alone, the old timber yard passing on his left like it always did, and went inside and sat on the edge of his bed and looked at the wood stove without lighting it for a long time. The desk he had fixed. The coat? He hadn't done anything about that because it felt like a different category of thing. Fixing a split in a work surface was practical. Buying a woman a coat was something else entirely, the kind of thing that could be taken wrong or come across as if he were solving her with money rather than seeing her as a person. But it was December now, and the coat was clearly insufficient, and she had said nothing about it, and he had said nothing about it. And every Wednesday he watched her walk out into the cold with that same insufficient coat, and it bothered him in a low, constant way that he could not make himself stop noticing. He compromised with himself. He left a scarf and a pair of good wool-lined gloves on her desk one Friday morning. The kind sold at the outfitters, practical rather than decorative, the sort of thing you could make an argument was a purely functional workplace consideration. No note. He arranged them beside her pencil jar in a way that suggested they'd been there for a while, even though they hadn't. When she came in and saw them, she stood at the doorway for a long moment. He was across the hall and he watched without being obvious about it. She picked up the gloves, turned them over, put them down, picked up the scarf and held it for a moment, looking at it. Then she looked across the hall directly at him, because she always knew when she was being watched. It was one of the things about her that he'd completely failed to account for. He didn't look away. She held up the scarf slightly, just a small lift, a wordless acknowledgement. Then she hung it on the corner of her chair and put on the gloves and sat down at her desk and went back to work. He did the same. But 3 days before Christmas, a Thursday, she came into the main floor area while Caleb was running through the end-of-year equipment inspection with 2 of the senior floor workers. She waited until he'd finished a section before she spoke. She always did that, always read the rhythm of a task and fit herself into the gaps rather than cutting across it, which was something he'd noticed and which was one of the 100 small things about her that he had been not thinking about since October. "The operating accounts for the full year are finished," she said. "Do you want to see them before I bring them to Miss Ashby?" He stepped away from the other men and came toward her. "Good numbers? Better than last year's, better than any year since 2019, in fact, if the pattern in the ledgers is right." She paused. "The fraud recovery helped, but it's not just that. The Halverson renegotiation terms are better by 17%. The East Shed repair prevented what would have been significant spoilage in the winter timber stock. The operational structure your father put in place when he first came on is being..." She caught herself. "Sorry, when you first came on, 6 years ago. My father worked here before me. You probably saw his name in the older ledgers." "I did. That's why I said it." She looked at him with that direct look. "You come from here. Grew up 12 miles east, came to work the mill at 19. And you've been here since." "And I've been here since," he confirmed. She was quiet for a moment in a way that felt like she was recalibrating something. "The year-end numbers," she said. "I can bring them to Nora if you're busy." "No, I'll come now." They walked to Nora's office together. It was not a Wednesday and they were not walking east, and it was the middle of the working day. And yet something about falling into step beside her in the corridor felt exactly like all the other times. That same particular quality of being in the right place without having deliberately planned to be there. He thought about it for the rest of the day, off and on, in between equipment checks and floor disputes and the 100 small logistical problems of running a mill in winter. He thought about it while he walked home that night through the dark, west as always, past the timber yard. He thought, this has to become something, eventually, or it has to stop. He had not yet figured out which of those things was going to happen. Christmas Eve fell on a Wednesday that year. The mill closed at noon and would not reopen until after New Year. The workers filed out into the cold with their pay envelopes and the general relief of men who'd earned a rest. Nora had put a small tin of shortbread on everyone's desk, which was the sort of gesture her father would not have thought of and which made Caleb like her more. He was locking up the equipment room when he heard footsteps and turned to find Iris in the doorway. She had her coat on, the gray one, insufficient, and her gloves, the good wool ones, and the scarf, the one he'd left on her desk, and her hat, and she was holding a piece of paper folded into thirds. "I'm leaving at the end of January," she said. He went very still. "There's a position in Millhaven, through the valley, a larger accounting firm. They wrote to me last week. One of the Halverson men apparently passed along my name, the one who wasn't Graves, the quieter one. It's a better salary." She looked at the paper in her hand. "I haven't accepted yet. I wanted—" She stopped. "I thought you should know." "Why?" he said. "Should I know?" She looked up at him. The equipment room was quiet. The mill was emptying out around them. The sounds of men leaving, boots on the wooden walkway, voices dropping away. The light was the gray-white winter light of late afternoon, coming through the small, high window. "Because you're the foreman," she said, and her voice was very steady. "Miss Ashby will need to be told, and I imagine you'd want— Iris." She stopped. "Why," he said again, quieter, "should I know?" The paper crinkled slightly where her hand was holding it. She didn't say anything. He had 11 Wednesday walks of not saying things behind him. He had a fixed desk and a pair of gloves and a scarf and 100 corridor conversations and a December full of standing at his gate watching the light go out of the sky while he waited for someone to come through a door. He was tired of not saying things. "Don't go," he said. It was not eloquent. It was not the careful, considered speech of a man who'd planned what he was going to say. It was just the truth, plainly stated the way he said everything. "Don't go," he said again. "Not because of the job. Not because we need you at the mill. Because I don't want you to go, and I should have told you that before you started looking for reasons to leave." She was looking at him with that calculating expression, but he understood it differently now than he had at first. It wasn't coldness, that expression. It was the face of a woman who'd had the floor pulled out from under her enough times that she'd learned to check carefully before she put her weight down. "The walks," she said. "Yes." "The desk." "Yes." "Every Wednesday for 11 weeks." "Yes." She folded the paper slowly and put it in her coat pocket. "Caleb, people like me don't usually—" She stopped. "I came here with $40 and a letter from a dead man. I'm not in a position to be—" "I'm not asking you because of your position," he said. "I'm not asking you because you rescued the accounts, or because you're useful, or because it would be convenient. I'm asking you because I walk east every Wednesday and then I walk home alone, and the walk home is worse every time." He paused. "That's what I should have said to you in November, outside the saloon, when you asked me what it was." The paper crinkled again in her pocket. She was very still. "I don't know how to do this," she said quietly. "I don't mean the sentiment. I mean, I've been taking care of myself for a long time. It's what I know how to do. I know. I'm not good at—" She made a small gesture, vague and honest. "This, whatever this would be. Neither am I," he said. "I built a cabin on the west side of town, and I haven't let anybody pass the front room in 6 years." Something shifted in her face. Not a smile exactly, but the thing her face did when she was close to one. "Merry Christmas, Caleb," she said. "Merry Christmas, Iris." She looked at him one more moment. Then she went east through the empty mill toward the front door, and he watched her go and did not call after her because whatever had just happened was either the beginning of something or the end of something, and either way, it needed a moment to sit. He walked home through the snow. He went west, past the old timber yard, and the cabin was cold when he got there, and he lit the wood stove and sat beside it in the dark and watched the fire take hold. She had not said yes. She had not said no. She had folded up the letter from Millhaven and put it in her coat pocket, and she had said Merry Christmas, and he had said it back. He thought, "I will find out what that means." He put more wood on the fire and let the cabin warm up around him, and outside the snow came down on Frost Creek, silent and patient, the way the best things always did. She did not take the Millhaven position. Caleb knew this not because she told him directly, but because she was still at her desk on the 2nd of January when the mill reopened, sitting in the same chair with the same pencil behind her ear and the same ledger open in front of her, and the folded letter from Millhaven was not mentioned again by either of them. He walked past her office doorway that first morning back, and she looked up and said, "The January supply order needs adjusting. The cedar pricing from the Halverson renegotiation takes effect this month, and Simmons hasn't updated the baseline figures." And he said, "I'll talk to Simmons." And that was that. No conversation about Christmas Eve, no acknowledgement of what he'd said in the equipment room. Just the work, picking up exactly where it had left off, as if the 2 weeks of holiday had been nothing more than a pause between sentences. He didn't push. He understood instinctively that pushing would be exactly the wrong thing, the same way he understood that certain pieces of equipment needed time to warm before you ran them at full load. She was thinking. He would wait. What he hadn't anticipated was that waiting had its own particular difficulty when the town was doing its level best to make everything harder. January in Frost Creek was the month when people ran out of things to talk about and started recycling older material with greater intensity. The cold kept everyone indoors, and proximity sharpened every opinion. The fact that Iris had not left, that the Millhaven rumor had circulated and then failed to produce a departure, gave the gossip a new angle to work with. Now the question wasn't whether Caleb was wasting his time on a woman who'd eventually move on. The question, as Pete Dawes put it with his characteristic gift for stating the uncomfortable plainly, was what exactly Caleb Rowan was waiting for. "You going to do something about it or not?" Pete said one morning, leaning against the wall of the equipment shed while Caleb reviewed the daily maintenance log. "About what?" "You know what." Caleb turned a page. "How's the tension on the secondary blade holding up since the adjustment?" "Fine. It's holding fine." Pete crossed his arms. "Look, I'm not saying this to be in your business. I'm saying it because the whole town is making up their own story, and you're not giving them anything true to replace it with." "What story are they telling?" Pete looked slightly uncomfortable, which meant it was bad. "Mostly that you're stringing her along, that she stays because she's got nowhere better to go, and you let her think there's something there when there isn't." He paused. "Nobody thinks that's actually what's happening, but nobody knows what's actually happening, so that's what they say." Caleb closed the maintenance log. He looked at Pete with the particular look that men who worked with him had learned meant the conversation was over, and they should walk away. Pete walked away, but the word stayed. She stays because she's got nowhere better to go. He turned that over for 3 days, the way you work a splinter out slowly, carefully, because hurrying made it worse. The problem with the town's version wasn't that it was entirely wrong. Iris did stay. She hadn't left, and he hadn't given her any clear reason beyond a single unpolished declaration in an empty equipment room on Christmas Eve, which she had neither accepted nor refused, and which they had both subsequently pretended hadn't happened. He was being, he realized with the cold clarity of a January morning, a coward about it. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that ran away from things. The quiet, stubborn, tells himself he's being patient kind, which was in some ways worse because it was so easy to mistake for virtue. The realization sat in him, uncomfortable, and he didn't do anything about it for 2 more weeks. What moved him in the end was not his own resolution. It was watching what was happening to Iris. She was pulling back. He could see it happening in small increments, the kind of change that was invisible day to day but unmistakable across a month. She was more formal in the corridor. She closed her office door more often. The ease that had developed between them on the Wednesday walks, the way she'd stopped measuring every word after the first month, had contracted back into something more careful. At the noon meal break, she ate at her desk instead of at the side table where she'd started joining him and Nora in December. He said nothing, watched, and understood what it meant. She was preparing. She was doing what she'd said she knew how to do, taking care of herself, closing off the part of herself that had started to expect something, because expecting things was how you got hurt, and she had clearly been hurt before in ways she hadn't told him about, and probably wouldn't. She was getting ready to leave without leaving. That was worse than Millhaven, somehow. It was a Tuesday when he finally did something about it. Not a Wednesday, not with the careful ritual of the East Road Walk as a framework. Just a regular Tuesday in late January, end of the working day. He knocked on her office door and opened it without waiting, which he rarely did anymore. She looked up. He could see the immediate adjustment in her expression, the slight gathering of herself, the professional composure coming forward like a shield she kept close by. "I owe you an answer," he said. She set her pencil down. "To what question?" "To the one you asked in November. What is it?" He leaned against the doorframe. "I didn't answer then. I should have." A beat of silence. "Caleb, you don't need to." "I know I don't need to. I'm going to anyway." He looked at her directly, the way he always did when he had something real to say. "It's not nothing. I said that much before. What I didn't say is that it hasn't been nothing since approximately the third Wednesday, when you told me about the billing fraud, and you said I'm not running a casual review, and I remember thinking that you were the most unsentimental and honest person I'd met in 6 years of this town. And I didn't know what to do with that, so I did nothing. For months." He paused. "That was the wrong call. I'm telling you now so you stop thinking you need to close up and go." She was looking at him with the careful, measuring expression, but her hands were still on the desk in a way that was different from her usual stillness. Not controlled, just quiet. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "You were getting ready to." A pause. "Yes," she admitted. "I was." Her jaw shifted slightly. "Old habit." "I know." "It doesn't mean—" She stopped. Tried again. "I don't know what I'm doing here any better than you do. I want to say that clearly." "I know that too. And I'm not easy," she said, and there was something underneath it that was half warning and half apology. "I've been on my own for a long time, and I'm set in my own ways, and I'm not going to suddenly be a different kind of person because something is happening. I haven't asked you to be. You say that now. I'll say it next year too." He pushed off from the doorframe. "Come eat supper. Not the boarding house. There's a place on Mill Street that does a decent meal on Tuesdays. I'm asking you to supper, Iris. Not as a Wednesday walk. As a deliberate choice." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp on her desk made a warm pool of light in the gray January dusk. Outside, the mill was closing down around them. "All right," she said quietly. They went to supper. It was not a perfect evening. The restaurant on Mill Street was noisy, and the table they were given was too close to the kitchen door, which swung open every few minutes and brought a gust of hot air and the smell of fried grease. The food was adequate rather than good. Iris knocked over her water glass in the first 10 minutes and went very still and precise in the way she did when she was embarrassed and would not show it, and Caleb mopped it up with his napkin without comment, and after that the evening loosened a little. They talked. Not about the mill, or at least not only about the mill, which was a first. She told him about growing up in eastern Oregon, not the frontier kind, but the flat, agricultural kind, a small town where her father had run a general store until it failed when she was 14. She said it without drama, in the way people describe a thing that was formative without being sentimental about it. After that, she'd gone to her aunt in Portland and learned bookkeeping from a man her aunt employed who had no patience for people who didn't pay attention and whose sheer irritability had made her very good very fast. "He sounds like a nightmare," Caleb said. "He was. I learned more from him than from anyone else I've ever worked for." She turned her coffee cup slowly. "I've thought about writing him to tell him that, and I've never done it." "Why not?" "Because then he'd know he'd been useful, and he'd be insufferable about it." A pause. "Also, I don't know where he is now. It's been 4 years." He told her about the cabin. Not much. Just that he'd built it himself, which surprised her, and that it had taken 2 summers, which surprised her more. She asked about his family, and he told her his father had worked the mill before him, which she'd already suspected from the ledgers, and that his mother had died young, and that he had a brother in Spokane he heard from twice a year. "You don't mind it?" she asked. "Being this far from family?" "I'm not far from much," he said. "This is where I'm from." "That's different from me." "I know. I don't come from anywhere, really. Not anymore." She said it plainly, without self-pity, and that plainness was somehow harder to hear than sadness would have been. "I come from places I've been, which means I can leave most of them without it costing too much." "Is that what you'd planned for here?" "Eventually." She looked at him across the table. "That was the plan," she said. "It's a good plan, usually. Usually. It requires not running into complications." He held her gaze for a moment. "Am I the complication?" "You and your Wednesday walks," she said, and the slight shift in her expression was as close to teasing as he'd seen from her, and it hit him somewhere under the sternum in a way he wasn't going to describe even to himself. "I can stop," he said, "if they're a problem." "Don't you dare," she said, and looked surprised at herself immediately after. He did not smile. He picked up his coffee and drank it. But he filed that, "Don't you dare," in the same place he kept the folded Millhaven letter she'd put in her pocket, and the way she'd held up the scarf in wordless acknowledgement, and a dozen other small things that were adding up to something he intended to be careful with. They walked back to the boarding house afterward. It was not a Wednesday. He walked east anyway, without comment, and she didn't tell him not to. At the door, she said, "That was a good supper." "The food was average," he said. "I didn't say the food was good." She looked at him directly in the cold air. "Good night, Caleb." "Good night." He walked home. He felt something that was uncomfortable in the specific way that good things sometimes were when you'd gone long enough without them. Like blood coming back into a numb limb. Not quite pain, but not quite pleasure either. Something that was both. He went west through the dark, and he thought, "This is happening, whatever this is. It's happening, and I'm going to have to figure out what comes next." February arrived, and the gossip shifted again, because gossip in a small town was nothing if not responsive to evidence. People had seen them at supper on Mill Street. Now the question was not what Caleb Rowan was waiting for, but whether Iris Holloway understood what she was getting into. This was delivered to her via Mrs. Pelham, who seemed to have appointed herself a kind of neutral informational service, offering intelligence from both sides with equal enthusiasm. "She means well," Iris told Caleb on a Wednesday in early February, their boots crunching through the snow that was now a constant feature of Frost Creek, rather than an event. "She genuinely thinks she's helping." What did she say this time? "That you're a good man, but a complicated one, and that I should make sure I understand what I'd be taking on." A pause. "She mentioned the cabin." "What about it?" "That you've never had anyone in it. That the men who've worked with you for years have never been past the front step." She glanced at him sideways. She seemed to think that was significant. "It might be," he said. "Is it?" He was quiet for a moment. The boarding house was half a block ahead. The street lamp made a yellow circle in the dark. "It's just a cabin," he said, which was not entirely honest, and he thought she probably knew it. "Caleb," her voice was careful. "I'm not asking because of what Mrs. Pelham said. I'm asking because, if something is going to be different between us, it probably should be different in both directions." He looked at her. "You've walked east 11, 12, 15 times now," she said. "You've come the wrong way for me every week. I'm not unaware of what that means, but I think I need to be able to see where you live." She said it plainly, without ornament. "Not tonight, not right now, but I think I need to know that's possible." He understood. She'd taken his declaration in December, the supper in January, the continued Wednesday walks. She'd taken all of it as evidence in good faith, and she was telling him that the evidence she needed now was a different kind. Not gestures, access, the willingness to be as visible to her as she'd been to this whole town since October. "Come on Sunday," he said. She blinked. "I didn't mean it had to be—" "Sunday's better than waiting," he said. "I'll make lunch." A pause. "You cook?" "Tolerably." He said it the way she said things, flat, accurate, without embellishment. "Don't expect much." Something shifted in her face again, that almost smile. "Sunday," she said. "Sunday." She went inside. He walked west, and this time the walk had a different quality to it. Not the familiar ache of alone, but the particular alertness of something approaching. He got home and looked at the cabin with new eyes for approximately 30 seconds, then went inside and made a list of everything that needed to be done before Sunday, which was longer than he would have liked. He spent Thursday and Friday evenings doing the things on the list. He did not do them frantically or desperately. He was not that kind of man. He did them steadily and practically. The stack of newspapers he'd been meaning to clear from the front room for 2 months, cleared. The table his father had built, which had needed re-leveling since September, re-leveled. The second chair, which had a broken rung, repaired with a piece of ash wood in 2 hours and the same careful attention he gave to mill equipment. He did not ask himself too carefully why he was doing it. Saturday, he told Nora that Iris would not be coming in the following day, which was technically unnecessary since Sundays were not working days, but which he said anyway because it felt right to acknowledge it to someone. Nora looked at him with the direct, slightly too perceptive gaze she'd been developing lately. "Good," she said simply. "Don't make something of it." "I'm not making anything of it." She turned back to her paperwork. "I'm glad, Caleb. I'm glad." He left before she could say anything else. Sunday came cold and clear. The kind of February day where the sky was a hard, brilliant blue, and the snow on the ground had crusted overnight and crunched under every step with a sound like broken glass. Iris appeared at the millside gate at noon, as they'd agreed, wearing the gray coat and the scarf and the good gloves, and they walked west together for the first time. It was strange, that first time going the right direction with someone beside him. The road was familiar to the point of invisibility for him, but he found himself seeing it differently with her there. The way the old timber yard looked from this angle, the gap in the tree line where you could see the mountain clearly in good weather, the particular quality of silence that the West Road had compared to Calloway Street. She was quiet, in this good way she had of being quiet. Not uncomfortable, just attentive, taking it in. The cabin sat at the end of a short track off the main road, sheltered on the north side by a stand of Douglas fir that had been there longer than the town. It was not impressive. It was small, solidly built, with a porch that still needed railings and a woodpile stacked on the east wall that was the most organized thing about the exterior. He'd painted the door a dark red 3 summers ago because his mother had always said a colored door made a house look like someone lived in it on purpose. Iris stopped at the end of the track and looked at it for a moment. "You built this," she said. 2 summers. I had help with the roof. It looks," she paused, "like someone built it to stay." That was the idea. He opened the door and she went in ahead of him, and he stood for a moment in the doorway watching her look at the place. The front room with the wood stove and the 2 chairs and the table his father built, the shelf of books along one wall, the window that looked out toward the fir stand. It was clean, plainer than her expression suggested she'd expected, and warm because he'd started the fire that morning before he left to meet her. "This is it," he said, unnecessarily. "Yes." She touched the back of one of the chairs lightly. "It's yours." That's a strange way to say it. I mean, it means something. You can feel it. She turned to look at him. "Some places are just rooms. This is yours." He didn't have an answer for that. He went to the kitchen and started lunch. Beans he'd had soaking overnight, cornbread, coffee, and she came to stand in the kitchen doorway, and after a few minutes she came in entirely and asked if she could help, and he handed her the cornbread skillet without fuss, and they stood in the small kitchen and made a simple meal together. They didn't talk about anything significant. She asked about the books on the shelf, and he told her which ones he'd read twice. She told him about a book she'd read 3 times on the train from Portland, which she'd then left on the seat accidentally and spent 6 months regretting. He said he'd get her another copy, and she said she'd probably find the second reading disappointing anyway. And he said that was probably true of most things revisited, and she said not all things, and the way she said it was careful and deliberate, and they both let it sit there without picking it up. Lunch was adequate. The cornbread was slightly better than adequate. They sat at his father's table and ate and talked about the mill, and then stopped talking about the mill because it was Sunday, and talked about other things instead, small things, the kind that don't sound like much and are actually everything. The way light moved in the fir stand in the afternoons. Whether the town would grow in the next 10 years or shrink. A book she thought he would like. A piece of equipment on the mill floor he was planning to reconfigure in the spring. After lunch, they sat with their coffee and the wood stove putting out steady heat, and the afternoon went quiet around them. "I understand now," she said. He looked at her. "Why no one's been here?" She was looking at the room, not at him. It's not that you're hiding it. It's that you were waiting for it to be worth something, to share it with someone it was worth sharing with." She paused. "That's a long time to wait." "It is," he said. "Was it—" She stopped. "Worth it?" he said. She looked at him then. Her expression was not the careful professional composure, and it was not the calculated assessment. It was something he hadn't seen before. Unguarded, a little uncertain, and more honest than almost anything she'd said to him in 4 months of Wednesdays. "Ask me again in a year," she said quietly. He thought that was probably the best answer she could give, and also one of the bravest things he'd heard. and he nodded once and let it be. She left before dark. He walked her back as far as the mill, and she went east the rest of the way alone, and he stood at the side gate and watched until she was out of sight, which he hadn't done before, and which he recognized as a significant development in his own private accounting. He went back to the cabin. The warmth was still in it from the afternoon. The 2 coffee cups were on the table where they'd left them. He did not put them away immediately. He left them there while he banked the fire for the night and looked at them in the firelight. 2 cups on a table built by his father in a room he'd built himself, that for the first time in its life had held 2 people in it on a Sunday afternoon. He washed the cups eventually, but not right away. Across town, in the boarding house on Calloway Street, Mrs. Pelham noted that Miss Holloway came in past 4 in the afternoon with cold reddened cheeks and something different in her expression that the landlady had not seen before and could not quite name. She mentioned this to her husband at supper. He told her to mind her own business, which she ignored entirely, and began composing her analysis of events for the general store crowd tomorrow. The town would talk. It always did. But for once, the thing the town would talk about was true, and neither Caleb nor Iris was afraid of it anymore, and that, more than anything else that February, was what had actually changed. March came in the way it always did in mountain country, not with any particular warmth, but with a kind of reluctant loosening, like a fist that hadn't fully decided to open yet. The snow on the west road developed a gray crust along the edges. The mill's east-facing roof began dripping at noon. Small signs. Nothing you'd call spring yet, but enough that men started talking about it, the way people in cold places talk about warmth when they've been without it long enough that the idea of it starts feeling more real than the thing itself. Caleb noticed it the way he noticed most things, practically in terms of what it meant for operations. Thaw meant mud. Mud meant the timber haul roads got soft, which slowed delivery, which affected the spring contract schedule. He spent the first week of March adjusting logistics, redistributing weight loads, getting ahead of problems before they arrived. Iris spent that same week doing something he didn't find out about until it was nearly finished. He found out because Nora told him, not because Iris had said anything. Nora came to find him on the floor on a Thursday morning with a look on her face that was somewhere between apologetic and genuinely troubled. "She's been writing letters," Nora said, without preamble. He turned from the equipment housing he'd been inspecting. "Who?" "Iris. She's been writing to accounting firms. Not just Millhaven. 3 others. 2 in Portland, 1 in Seattle." Nora folded her hands in front of her in the particular way she had when she was delivering news she'd rather not. "I saw the envelopes on her desk yesterday when I brought her the quarterly reports. I wasn't snooping. They were right there." He was quiet. "I don't know if she sent them yet," Nora added. "I didn't ask her. I thought you should know first." He went back to the equipment housing, stared at it for a moment without seeing it. "Thank you," he said. Nora left. He stood there with a wrench in his hand and the particular cold feeling of a man who thinks something is going well and then finds out it has been running underneath him in a different direction entirely. The thing was, he understood it. He understood it immediately, which was almost worse than being blindsided would have been. She had told him in February, at his own kitchen table, that she didn't know how to stop preparing for exits. Old habit, she'd called it, the same way someone might describe a flinch they'd developed after getting hit enough times. It wasn't that she'd decided to leave. It was that she didn't fully trust staying. What bothered him, really bothered him, in the low-grade, persistent way that things bother you when they matter, was that she hadn't told him. That she was sitting in the office 20 feet down the corridor, writing letters to Portland and Seattle, and had said nothing about it on any of the Sundays they'd shared lunch at his table, any of the Wednesday walks, any of the corridor conversations that had become so ordinary he'd stopped registering them as choices and started taking them for granted. He put the wrench down on the housing shelf. He went back to work. He thought about it all day. By evening, he had decided 2 things. First, he was not going to pretend he hadn't found out. He was constitutionally unsuited to pretending. Second, whatever he said had to be the right thing, not just the immediate thing, because this was the kind of moment where saying too much was as damaging as saying nothing. He knocked on her office door at the end of the day, same as always. She was at her desk with the ledger open, same as always. "Walk?" he said. She got her coat. They went east. They were halfway to the boarding house before he said anything. The road was wet cold. the sky a deep blue-gray that still held some light at the edges. Their boots made the same sounds they'd been making since October. "Nora told me," he said. A pause. 2 steps. 3. "The letters," Iris said. "Yes." She didn't apologize. He'd half expected her to and was glad she didn't, because an apology would have suggested she thought she'd done something wrong, and he didn't think she had. "I haven't sent them," she said. Nora said she didn't know. "I haven't." She kept walking, kept her eyes forward. "I wrote them on a Tuesday night after. I'd had a bad day and I was in my head, and it's what I do when I'm in my head. I write the letters. Sometimes I send them, and sometimes I don't." "What kind of bad day?" She was quiet for a moment. "I overheard something in the general store. Mrs. Hartley and one of the women from the East End, I didn't catch her name. They were talking about me and didn't see me come in." Another pause. "It wasn't anything I hadn't imagined people saying. She doesn't belong here. She'll take what she can get and move on. That sort of thing." Her voice was flat and controlled. "I know it shouldn't affect me. It did anyway." He walked beside her and didn't say it was fine or it didn't matter, because it wasn't, and it did. "I'm sorry," he said instead. "You shouldn't have to absorb that. Everyone absorbs it. Women like me especially. It's the tax on being somewhere you didn't come from." She glanced at him sideways. "I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you because you asked why I had a bad day, and that's why." "I know." "The letters are still on my desk," she said, "unsealed." "What would make you seal them?" She stopped walking. He stopped a half step after her and turned to look at her. She was looking at the road ahead, not at him, her jaw set in the way it got when she was deciding something. "I don't know," she said. "I think I'm waiting to find out if this is real or if I'm making it into something because I need it to be real." She finally looked at him. "Those are different things, and I can't always tell them apart from the inside." He looked at her in the fading light. This woman who had been running the internal accounting of their relationship with the same precision she brought to everything, watching for fraud the way she always watched for fraud, because she'd been in this particular position before and the numbers had turned out wrong. "It's real," he said. "I don't know how to prove it to you except to keep showing up, but it's real." She held his gaze for a long moment. The cold air moved between them. Somewhere down the street, a door closed. "I know," she said quietly. "I think that's what scares me." She went inside. He walked home. He did not sleep well that night. He lay in the dark in the cabin he'd built himself and thought about a woman writing letters she hadn't sent, sitting alone in a boarding house room, trying to figure out if the thing she was in the middle of was trustworthy, and doing all of that thinking by herself because she hadn't yet entirely learned how to do it with someone else in the room. By morning, he had decided something. He did not do it immediately. He let a week go by. Not from hesitation, but because he wanted to be sure the decision was coming from the right place. There was a version of what he was planning that was about his own discomfort, about wanting to resolve the uncertainty so he didn't have to sit in it anymore. And that version would be the wrong reason. He tested the decision against that question every day for 7 days. At the end of 7 days, it still held, so he did it. It was a Sunday. She came to the cabin as she'd been doing most Sundays since February, and they had lunch, and afterwards sat with their coffee in the 2 chairs by the wood stove. The light was better now. The March light had more angle to it, coming through the window and landing differently than it had in the gray weeks of January. He didn't lead up to it. He'd learned that she preferred directness, that preamble made her suspicious rather than prepared. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him over her coffee cup. "I want to ask you to stay. Not the way I asked before, not don't go. Don't take the Millhaven job. I mean permanently. I mean as my wife." He held her gaze. "I'm not asking because you've been useful to the mill or because you don't have anywhere better to go. I know that's what people say, and I want to be clear that's not what this is. I'm asking because every walk I've taken back to this cabin alone has been worse than the one before it, and I want the walks to end differently." He paused. "That's it. That's the whole argument." The wood stove made its particular sound, the low tick of metal warming. Outside, a bird, early for March, optimistic, made one short sound and stopped. Iris set her coffee cup down on the arm of the chair. She was looking at him with the expression he'd learned to read now. Not the professional composure, Not the assessment, but the real face underneath, the one that showed up in the cabin and nowhere else. "You built this place to stay," she said. "I did. And the door is red because your mother said a colored door meant someone lived in a house on purpose." He told her that in passing, 2 Sundays ago. He hadn't expected her to hold on to it. "Yes. I come from nowhere, Caleb. I said that before. I have $40 in savings and a cracked suitcase and whatever Nora pays me, which is fair but not lavish." She was saying this not as an objection, he understood, but as inventory, the honest accounting of what she was bringing to the table. "I know what you come with," he said. "I'm not marrying your balance sheet." Something crossed her face, not quite a laugh, but the surprised, involuntary thing that happened before you decided whether to laugh. It was gone quickly. She looked at her hands. "I'm not an easy person," she said again. She said it the way she always said it, half warning, half the truth about herself that she'd figured out the hard way. "Iris." His voice was patient, the particular patience that wasn't performing patience, but just was it. "I know. I've known since November. I'm not asking for easy. I'm asking for you." She was quiet for a long time, long enough that the fire shifted in the wood stove and the bird outside tried again, and this time kept going. "I haven't told you about my mother," she said. He waited. "She left when I was 11. Not for another man or anything dramatic. She just found the life she was living too small for her and left for something bigger, and that bigger thing didn't include us." A pause. "I don't blame her the way I did when I was young. I understand it better now. But it's why I learned to leave before things got too close. Because leaving first is less expensive than being left." She looked up at him. "You should know that about me, where the habit comes from." "Thank you for telling me," he said. "I'm not good at staying," she said. "I want to be. I've been, since I came here, since the first Wednesdays, I've been wanting to be different about it. But wanting to be different and actually being different are not the same thing. And I can't promise you I've figured out the gap yet." "No one figures it out before they start," he said. "That's not how it works." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light came through the window, and the wood stove held the heat, and the cabin sat around them, solid and deliberate, built by hand to stay. "Ask me again," she said. "Iris Holloway." He said her full name the way he said things that mattered, plainly, without ornament, directly. "Will you marry me?" She took a breath that was slightly unsteady, which he noticed and which she did not try to hide. "Yes," she said. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no particular ceremony to it. He didn't move from his chair, and she didn't move from hers, and the wood stove kept ticking, and the bird outside kept at it. But something in the room changed, some quality of the air, some shift in the weight of the afternoon. After a moment, she said, "The letters are still on my desk." "I know. I'll throw them out Monday morning." "All right." She picked up her coffee cup again. He picked up his. They sat in the 2 chairs by the wood stove and finished their coffee, and outside the March light moved across the floor as the afternoon turned, and neither of them felt the need to say anything else for a while. That was the right way for it to happen, he thought. Not perfect. Not the version of the story that anyone would tell later with the details that made it sound like it had been inevitable. Just 2 people in a warm room deciding something true. When she left that afternoon, he walked her back to the road, and at the point where their paths divided, east toward Calloway Street, west back to the cabin, she stopped and looked at him. "The town is going to talk," she said. "The town has been talking since October. This will be louder." "Probably." He looked at her. "Does that change anything?" She considered it, the way she actually considered things rather than performing the consideration. "No," she said, "it doesn't." "Then let them talk." She went east. He watched her until the road curved and she was gone. Then he turned west and walked home through the improving March light, past the old timber yard, past the gap in the trees where the mountain showed clear, all the way to the red door at the end of the short track. He went inside and put 2 cups on for coffee. He would drink alone, and then caught himself and put one back, and stood in the kitchen for a moment thinking about all the Sundays coming where that would not be the calculation anymore. He sat in his chair by the wood stove with his single cup, and the afternoon going quiet around him, and thought about a woman walking east through Frost Creek with a yes in her pocket, back to a boarding house she would not be in much longer. He thought about the 11 Wednesday walks it had taken to get here, and the one conversation he almost didn't have in an empty equipment room on Christmas Eve, and the 7 days he'd made himself wait before asking the real question. He thought, I should have asked sooner. Then he thought, no, it needed to happen the way it happened. She needed to see the cabin and sit in it on enough Sundays that it felt possible. She needed to tell him about her mother. He needed to let her write the letters to Portland and Seattle without making it into something catastrophic, because a person who'd been leaving all her life needed to be allowed to hold the door open even while she was choosing to stay. None of it had been smooth. Most of it had been uncomfortable in one way or another. There had been no moment where he'd felt certain, just a series of moments where he'd chosen to keep going rather than stop. That, he supposed, was what it actually was. Not the version with all the rough edges sanded off. The actual thing. He finished his coffee. He banked the fire for the evening. He went out to the porch. Still no railings. He would get to that before summer. And stood in the cold for a moment looking at the fur stand in the fading light. Across town, he knew, Iris was walking up the steps of the boarding house. She was probably composing the version of her face she wore for Mrs. Pelham, the neutral, pleasant one that gave nothing away. She was probably already thinking about Monday morning and the letters on her desk and what she'd say to Nora. He didn't know what any of it was going to look like yet. He knew what the mill would say, and the town, and Mrs. Pelham. He knew there would be days ahead that were hard in new ways he hadn't anticipated yet. He knew Iris would still reach for the exits sometimes, by instinct, when things felt too close, and that he would have to learn the difference between giving her room and losing her to the old habit. He didn't know how to do most of it. He was going to have to figure it out as it happened, the same way he'd built the cabin, one piece at a time, checking the level, making sure each part was solid before he added the next. He went back inside and closed the red door behind him. They were married on the first Saturday of April, when the mountain passes were still half closed and the mud on the west road had not yet decided to firm up for good. Iris had not wanted anything large. That was the first and clearest thing she said when the subject came up, sitting at Caleb's kitchen table on the Sunday after he'd asked, and she'd said yes, with coffee going cold between them and a list of practical considerations laid out with the same systematic attention she gave everything. No formal reception, no borrowed dress she'd have to return. The town hall was available on Saturdays, and the magistrate who handled the Halverson recovery documents was also authorized for civil ceremonies, which struck her as efficient. You don't want the church, Caleb said. It wasn't a question. I want something real, she said. A church ceremony in a town where half the congregation spent 6 months deciding what to think about me feels more like a performance than a thing. She paused. Do you have a preference? He thought about it honestly. No, he said. I want it to be something you can stand in without bracing yourself. She looked at him across the table. That's exactly it. So it was the town hall on a Saturday morning in April, with Nora as the only witness they'd formally invited, and whatever townspeople chose to come on their own account because word had spread, which, this being Frost Creek, meant most of the eastern half of town showed up without being asked, standing in the back and along the walls with the slightly self-conscious air of people who knew they hadn't exactly earned their attendance but were there anyway. Caleb wore the same dark coat he wore to everything that required a dark coat. Iris had a blue dress she'd bought herself in February from the dry goods store, practical wool, not new but recently pressed. She'd done something different with her hair, still pinned, but softer, which Mrs. Pelham had apparently insisted on, and which Iris had permitted with the resignation of a woman picking her battles. The magistrate, a lean older man named Gould, who had the particular energy of someone who'd been present at enough significant moments that he'd learned not to inflate them unnecessarily, read the civil language in the same unhurried tone he used for everything else, and Caleb and Iris said what needed to be said, and it was done. Nora, standing to the left, cried a little, which surprised her visibly and which she dealt with by looking at the ceiling for a moment and blinking until it passed. Caleb noticed and did not remark on it, which was the right call. Iris noticed and reached over briefly and touched Nora's arm, which was such a departure from her usual self-containment that Nora nearly lost it a second time. From the back of the hall, Pete Dawes started clapping, which started everyone else clapping. And then someone, nobody ever figured out who, started cheering, and the town hall of Frost Creek filled up with the sound of 400 people expressing an enthusiasm that most of them had spent 5 months working up to. Iris stood beside her husband in the noise and looked slightly overwhelmed and slightly amused and more at peace than Caleb had ever seen her. He leaned down and said something into her ear that nobody else could hear. She laughed, a real laugh, the unguarded kind she almost never produced in public, and shook her head. Later, people would ask what he'd said. He never told them. She didn't either. They walked out of the town hall together, and instead of going east toward Callaway Street or stopping at the point in the road where they'd always separated, they went west, past the mill, past the side gate where Caleb had waited every Wednesday since October, past the old timber yard that had become, without either of them deciding it, a landmark on a road that now meant something different than it used to. They went home. The cabin was exactly what it had always been, small, solidly built, practical, except that Iris's cracked leather suitcase was in the bedroom, which she'd brought over the day before, and there were 2 different coffee cups on the shelf now instead of the single one he'd used for 6 years, and the second chair by the wood stove had a wool blanket on it that she'd brought from the boarding house because the cabin got cold in the evenings, and she ran cold by nature. These were small things. They changed everything about the feel of the room. "The porch still needs railings," she said, looking out the front window at it. "I'll get to it this spring." "I'm just noting it." "You've noted it twice now." "Because it's been noted twice and nothing has happened." She turned from the window. "I'm not criticizing. I'm establishing a baseline." He looked at her standing in his front room, their front room, with that particular expression she had, the one that was practical on the surface and something warmer underneath. And he thought, yes, this is what I walked east all those Wednesdays for. He did not say that out loud. He went and got his coat and told her he'd be back in 2 hours. And she asked where he was going, and he said to get lumber for the porch railing, and she looked at him with an expression that was equal parts startled and exasperated and something close to delighted. "You're doing it today," she said. "Baseline's been established twice," he said. She shook her head. He went to get the lumber. The porch got its railings that afternoon, which Caleb built and Iris held pieces for while wearing her work gloves and telling him twice that he'd measured wrong. She was right both times, which he acknowledged without elaborating on. And by evening it was done, and they stood on the porch together in the cooling air and looked out at the fir stand, and it was not a perfect porch railing, but it was a real one. "Better," she said. "Thank you. You told me to. You did it anyway." She looked at him sideways. "Don't make me explain why that's different." He understood why it was different. He didn't make her explain it. The first months of the marriage were not the easy kind. He'd known they wouldn't be. 2 people who'd been entirely on their own for years, both set in their own rhythms, both accustomed to the particular silence of living alone. She was a light sleeper, and he moved through the early morning preparation for the mill with a heaviness that he hadn't realized until someone else was being disturbed by it. She had opinions about where things went in the kitchen that were different from his opinions, and she held them with the quiet tenacity of someone who'd found a system that worked and had no interest in abandoning it. He had a habit of going silent when he was troubled about something instead of saying he was troubled about something, which she had apparently decided she would not tolerate. "You've been doing it all week," she said on a Thursday evening in May, when the spring had finally arrived in earnest and the evening was warm enough that they'd eaten supper on the newly railed porch. "Whatever's on your mind." "It's nothing that needs—" "Caleb," she set her fork down. "I told you about my mother. You know why I do the things I do. That means when you go silent for a week, I'm doing math in my head about what it means, and I'd rather not." She paused. "What is it?" He looked at his plate. The thing on his mind was, in fact, about her, about a conversation he'd overheard at the mill between 2 floor workers who'd had enough of the wrong kind of April whiskey to say things they'd normally have kept quiet. Things about Iris. About what the town really thought about a woman who'd shown up with nothing and managed to marry the foreman inside of 7 months. He'd shut the conversation down before it went further, but he'd heard enough, and he'd been carrying it since Tuesday without knowing what to do with it. He told her. Plainly, without softening it more than necessary, because she always knew when something was being softened and it made things worse. She listened. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the fir stand in the evening light. "What did you say to them?" she asked. "I told them to get back to work." "That's all?" "It was enough. They knew." He paused. "I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner. Yes, she said. You should have. She picked up her fork again. I've heard worse. I'll hear worse again. I don't need you to protect me from it. I need you to not carry it around by yourself for 5 days because you're trying to protect me from it. That's a fine distinction. It's an important one. She looked at him directly. I don't need a shield. I need a partner. He held her gaze. I'm getting better at that. You are, she said. So am I. She went back to her supper. Those 2 men, are they going to be a problem? No, they understood what I didn't say. Good. She thought for a moment. Pete Dawes would probably tell you to just fire them. Pete Dawes has opinions about everything. He was right about most of it, actually. She glanced at him. He told me in March that you'd been impossible to work with since October because you were busy being in love with someone and pretending you weren't. He seemed to find it very funny. Caleb stared at her. He said that to you? Several things along those lines, yes. He was quite cheerful about it. She kept her expression neutral with obvious effort. I found it informative. He shook his head. Pete Dawes was going to hear about this. Pete Dawes, who had been asking nosy questions since November and apparently conducting his own separate campaign of information sharing with both parties simultaneously, was going to hear about this in very clear terms. Iris was watching him work through it and was visibly not laughing. He meant well, she said. He always means well. It doesn't make him less. He told me you fixed my desk before I figured out it had been fixed, she said. I already knew, but I hadn't known it was you specifically. I thought it might have been the maintenance crew. A pause. It was a good thing to know. He said nothing. Anyway, she stood and began clearing the plates. The Halverson spring contract review is next week. Graves will be there. I know. He's going to try something with the drying shed pricing. I've been looking at the rate structure, and there's a clause in the original agreement he probably thinks we missed. She went inside, and he heard her moving in the kitchen, and he sat on the porch for a moment longer in the May evening and thought about Pete Dawes and Graves and the 2 workers who'd said things on a Tuesday, and the fact that none of the difficulty, the sideways town, the gossip, the ledger battles, none of it felt like the wrong kind of hard. It felt like his life. Finally, actually, his life. He went inside to help with the dishes. The Halverson meeting came, and Graves did try the clause, exactly as Iris had predicted. He arrived at the mill with a revised rate sheet and the particular confidence of a man who'd done his research and expected to benefit from it. He sat across the table from Nora and laid out his argument with the practiced ease of someone who'd renegotiated enough contracts to know where the pressure points were. Iris set a counter document on the table 3 minutes into his presentation. Section 11 of the original agreement, she said, specifies that rate adjustments to ancillary services require 30 days written notice and must be submitted before the 1st of the contract month. This is the 9th. She tapped the page. We're 8 days past the window. Graves looked at the document, then he looked at Iris, then he looked at Nora. Miss Ashby, he said, with the slight emphasis that suggested he intended to go around Iris to the actual decision-maker. Mrs. Rowan handles the contract review, Nora said. If you have questions about the document, you should address them to her. Graves turned back to Iris. Something in his expression shifted, not warm exactly, but recalibrating. You're very thorough, he said. I try to be. She pushed the counter document slightly further across the table toward him. The original rate structure holds through the end of the quarter. We're open to renegotiation beginning in July with proper notice. I've prepared a proposed adjustment schedule that I think you'll find fair. It accounts for the market pricing shift you're responding to while keeping the terms within the original contract framework. He picked up the proposed schedule. He read it. He read it again. This is reasonable, he said, in a tone that suggested he'd expected it not to be. It's meant to be, she said. We want a long-term relationship with Halverson. That requires both sides to feel the terms are workable. He signed off on the extension of the original rate structure and agreed to come back in July. When he left, Nora sat back in her chair and let out a slow breath. You knew he was going to try the clause, she said. I know Graves. Iris gathered the documents into their folder. He's not dishonest. He just tests every edge of an agreement to see which ones hold. Once he knows you're watching, he stops testing. How many times is that going to happen before he stops testing? Once or twice more, probably. Then he'll just negotiate straight. She looked at Nora. You did well. You held your position. I said 7 words. The right 7 words at the right time, without flinching. Iris handed her the folder. That's harder than it sounds. Nora held the folder and looked at her. This woman who'd come to the mill in October with nothing and had spent the intervening months quietly becoming the backbone of its financial operation, and who was now also, somehow, her friend. Can I ask you something? You can ask. Did you know, when you first came here, did you know it was going to turn out like this? Iris considered it honestly. No, she said. I knew there was a job that might not exist anymore. I knew I had enough money for 6 weeks if it didn't work out. She paused. I didn't know about any of the rest of it. Are you glad? A pause that was a beat longer than usual. Yes, she said. I am. She said it plainly, without the careful hedging she used to apply to statements about her own feelings. I'm glad. Nora nodded, satisfied. She went back to her desk. Iris went back to hers. Down on the floor, Caleb was running a production check on the afternoon shift output and trying not to think about the meeting happening overhead, because Iris had told him specifically that she did not need him anywhere near the Halverson conversation, that his presence would imply she couldn't handle it herself, and she was entirely right. He'd stayed on the floor. Pete came by with the shift numbers and lingered in the way he did when he had something to say. How'd it go up there? Pete asked. Don't know. Still going. Graves is a snake. Graves is a businessman. Different thing. Caleb reviewed the numbers. These are too short on the east stack. Henderson miscounted. I'll fix it. Pete didn't move. You should have seen the town hall, you know, when you two walked out. Old Doris Pelham was crying. She was not. Hand to whatever you want to swear by. Full tears. Pete shook his head with the appreciation of a man who enjoys being right about human nature. I told you back in November. I told you the whole town wanted it to work out. You told me there was talk. There's always talk. Talk doesn't mean what people actually want. Pete finally moved to go fix the Henderson count, then stopped. She's good for you, and the mill, and Nora. He said it simply as a statement of fact. That's all. He walked off before Caleb could respond, which was probably deliberate. Caleb stood with the production numbers in his hand and the afternoon shift moving around him, and thought about October and a woman stepping off a supply wagon with a cracked suitcase and a dead man's letter, and how none of them, not Pete, not Nora, not Doris Pelham, and certainly not Caleb himself, had understood what was actually arriving that day. Not just a bookkeeper, not just someone to fix the accounts, someone who stayed. Not because she had nowhere to go. She'd had Portland and Seattle and Millhaven. She'd had options, and she'd had the ability to make more, but because she'd made the choice, slowly and honestly, and with full knowledge of what it cost her, to put her weight down and stop checking the floor. The mill whistle blew at the end of the afternoon shift. The floor began to empty, men collecting jackets and heading for the door, voices rising with the end-of-day release. Upstairs, he heard footsteps in the corridor that he recognized without having to think about it. The particular rhythm of Iris's walk, purposeful and even. She appeared in the stairwell doorway. It went well, she said. I gathered. He tried the claws. I know. I prepared for it. I know that too. He put the production numbers on the floor supervisor's desk. Ready? She got her coat from the hook by the door. The new one she'd bought herself in March, heavier than the gray one, dark green wool that fit properly, and her gloves, and they left the mill together as the last of the afternoon workers filed out around them. They went west, past the side gate, past the point in the road where Caleb had once stopped every Wednesday and turned around and walked back alone, past the old timber yard, which was just the timber yard now, just a familiar thing on a familiar road. The evening air was warm in the way that May evenings in the mountains sometimes managed, briefly, like a gift that knew it wasn't going to last long. Somewhere behind them, Frost Creek settled into its evening. The mill went quiet. Lights came on in windows. Doris Pelham, at the boarding house on Callaway Street, looked at the room that had been Iris Holloway's and thought about the person who had lived in it and how she had turned out to be nothing like what the town had expected, and better. Pete Dawes, walking home in the opposite direction, thought about the shift numbers and the Henderson miscount, and, briefly, about the foreman who had walked the wrong direction for 11 Wednesdays, and smiled to himself in the way of a man who had been correct about something and intended to continue being correct about it. Nora Ashby sat at her father's desk in the mill office and opened the quarterly report Iris had prepared and read through the numbers. Numbers that were better than last year, better than any year she'd found in the old ledgers, and felt, for the first time since her father's death, that the thing he had built was going to be all right. More than all right. She thought about the woman who had come in October with a dead man's letter, who had found the fraud and rebuilt the accounts, and held her ground with Graves and quietly, without anyone quite seeing it happen, become indispensable. She thought about Caleb, who had walked the wrong direction for months because the right direction, for once, was east. She closed the quarterly report. She turned off the lamp on her father's desk. She went home. And on the west road, in the May evening light, Caleb and Iris walked toward the cabin with the red door, and the porch with the new railings, and the 2 cups on the shelf, and the wood stove that worked better than it looked, and neither of them felt any particular need to mark the moment or describe what it was. It was just the walk home. It was enough. 10 years changes a place the way water changes stone, not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, in ways you only fully see when you stop and look at what it used to be. Frost Creek Mill. The spring of its 11th year under Nora Ashby's management was not the same operation that had nearly collapsed under its own mismanaged accounts a decade earlier. The East Wing drying shed had been rebuilt twice, once after the original repair Iris had recommended with the recovered fraud money, and once again 3 years later when a winter ice load took out the north wall and they'd rebuilt it larger and better than before. The main floor had expanded. There were 12 more men on the payroll than there had been in Caleb's first year as foreman. The Halverson contract, once the source of billing fraud and tense renegotiations, had grown into the mill's most reliable revenue relationship, partly because Graves had eventually stopped testing the edges of the agreement and started treating Iris like the professional she'd always been, and partly because Nora had developed the particular skill of knowing when to push and when to let something settle. The town had grown too. Not dramatically. Frost Creek was never going to be a city, but the settlement had thickened, filled in, become more permanent feeling in the way that places do when enough people decide they're staying. A second general store. A schoolhouse that replaced the one-room arrangement with something that had 3 rooms and a proper teacher imported from Portland. A doctor who'd arrived 2 years back and, finding the place agreeable, had not left. And the cabin on the west road, the one with the red door and the porch that had gotten its railings on the day of the wedding, had changed too. Not in its bones. Caleb had built it to last, and it had lasted, but in the specific way that living in a place changes it. A second bedroom added on the north side when it became necessary, built the same summer as the first child and finished 3 weeks before she arrived, which had been close enough that Iris had made certain observations about planning and timelines that Caleb did not argue with because she was not wrong. A garden on the south side that was Iris's project and which she tended with the same systematic attention she gave everything, meaning it was productive rather than decorative, and she would tell you the difference if you asked. The fir stand on the north edge had a rope swing in it now, hung from the lowest solid branch at a height that Caleb had measured carefully and that his daughter had immediately tested to destruction, requiring a second installation. His daughter was 9 years old and had her mother's eyes and his stubbornness, and a quality all her own that neither of them had anticipated. A fearlessness that was different from recklessness, the kind that came from having been shown consistently that the ground was solid. Her name was Clara. She had opinions about everything and expressed them without particular concern for whether they were welcome, which Iris said she must have gotten from somewhere, and Caleb did not touch that statement with any implement. The boy was 6. His name was Thomas, which had been his grandfather's name, Caleb's father, who had worked this same mill 30 years before and whose table still sat in the kitchen, re-leveled twice now and still solid. Thomas was quieter than Clara, which was not difficult, and had a quality of watching that reminded Caleb so acutely of his mother at 7 months old that he sometimes had to stop and breathe through it. He already showed an interest in how things worked, not in the dramatic way of a child who wanted to be told about machinery, but in the patient, careful way of someone who wanted to actually understand it. Caleb had been letting him sit in the equipment shed on Saturday mornings for the past year, not explaining anything, just letting him watch. Thomas asked questions only when he had them, which meant the questions were always real ones. Iris said this was going to be expensive when he was older because the kind of mind that asked only real questions eventually wanted to go somewhere that could answer them properly. Caleb thought she was right. He was already thinking about it. The morning that begins the last chapter of this story was a Wednesday, the same day of the week it had always been, though Caleb no longer tracked Wednesdays specifically. They had long since stopped being a ritual and become simply a day. He was at the mill by 5:30 as always, going through the morning preparation with the foreman's habit he'd had for 16 years. The whistle blew at 5:30, the floor filled up, and the day began. At mid-morning, Nora came to find him on the floor, which she still did when something required his direct attention rather than a message through the usual channels. She had the look she had when the thing she was going to tell him was complicated. "Halverson sent a man," she said over the noise of the equipment. "Not Graves. Someone new. Graves retire, apparently. The new man's name is Colton. He's waiting in my office." She paused. "He brought a revised contract proposal. Significant revisions." Caleb pulled his gloves off. "How significant?" "Iris is already in there reading it." Nora's expression said something he understood, that the situation was being handled, but that his presence was probably wanted. He followed her upstairs. The office smelled the same as it always had, old wood and paper, and the particular sharpness of ink, but it looked different than it had in Nora's early years. The overwhelming chaos of a young woman trying to manage paperwork she didn't understand had been replaced by a system that was orderly without being rigid, the kind of organization that a practiced eye had installed and a careful hand maintained. Nora's own touches were in it now, too. A map of the region's timber holdings on the north wall, an expansion of the original filing system into a secondary cabinet that had been Iris's idea and Nora's implementation. Iris was at the side table with the contract proposal spread in front of her, reading with the focused intensity that had not changed in 10 years. The man called Colton was sitting across from Nora's desk, early 30s, well-dressed in the way of someone who'd been told this meeting was important and wanted to look like he understood that. He stood when Caleb came in, which was either genuine courtesy or had been coached. "Mr. Rowan," Nora said. "This is Daniel Colton, representing Halverson interests." Caleb shook his hand. "What are we looking at?" Colton glanced at Iris, who had not looked up from the document. "I was explaining to Mrs. Rowan. Mrs. Rowan is fine," Iris said, without looking up, "that Halverson is looking to expand the agreement significantly. Larger volume commitments, longer contract term, adjusted pricing structure." He said it with the slight over-precision of someone presenting a case they expected to be challenged on. "We believe it represents a substantial opportunity for the mill." "For Halverson too, I imagine," Caleb said. "Both parties benefit, yes." Iris turned a page, turned another. She was quiet for a moment that everyone in the room felt the weight of, because a decade of watching Iris Holloway be quiet before she said something had taught the people around her that the silence was part of the process. "Section 4, she said finally. Colton's posture adjusted slightly. "Yes. The volume commitment locks us into a minimum monthly output that exceeds our current winter capacity by 11%. She looked up at him now, directly, with the dark eyes that had cataloged and assessed things since the day she'd stepped off the supply wagon. That 11% isn't a minor figure. In a bad winter, ice on the haul roads, equipment issues which happen, we'd be in breach. The contract includes a weather provision. The weather provision covers acts of nature. It doesn't cover equipment failure, labor shortages, or supply chain delays." She pushed the relevant page across the table. "If you want a 10-year commitment from this mill, we need a realistic capacity baseline and a force majeure clause with language broad enough to actually protect both parties." Colton looked at the page. He looked at Nora. He looked at Caleb, in the particular way that men of a certain type sometimes looked at the nearest available man when a woman had said something inconvenient. Caleb met his gaze pleasantly and said nothing. Colton looked back at Iris. "I'll need to go back to the principals with those terms," he said. "I expected that." She slid a second document across the table, a counterproposal, which she had apparently drafted between receiving his document and this moment, which meant she'd either read very fast or had anticipated what Halverson was going to attempt. Both were plausible. "This is what we'd need to see to make a 10-year commitment workable." The volume numbers are adjusted to a figure we can guarantee across seasons, not just in good conditions. The pricing structure accounts for that adjustment. I think if your principals look at the long-term revenue projection, they'll find the reduced volume commitment more valuable than a higher number they can hold us in breach on. Colton took the counterproposal. He read the first page. Something in his posture changed, the adjustment of a man recognizing he was dealing with someone who had done this before and was not going to be moved by impatience or pressure or the subtle suggestion that there was a more appropriate person to be talking to. "Mr. Graves mentioned you," he said. "I expect he did," she said, and went back to reviewing the original document. Colton left an hour later with the counterproposal and the commitment to return in 2 weeks, which was a better outcome than Nora had expected and exactly the outcome Iris had targeted. Nora walked him out. Caleb stayed. Iris gathered the documents into their folder with the same careful, methodical efficiency she'd had at 26, except that 10 years of practice had made it faster and less visible, the way any real skill eventually becomes. "You already had the counterproposal," he said. "I drafted it Tuesday night when Nora told me Halverson had sent a representative." "You didn't tell me." She glanced at him. "You were busy with the equipment assessment." "You could have mentioned it." "You would have asked questions I didn't have answers to yet." She finished with the folder. "I had answers by this morning." He looked at her across the table. His wife of 10 years, mother of his children, the person who had reshaped this mill's financial foundation from the inside with the patience and precision of someone laying groundwork that was meant to last, and thought about the woman who had arrived with $40 and a dead man's letter, who had announced herself at the doorway of his office with, "I have a legitimate employment contract," and held the line on that claim with a jaw that didn't move, regardless of what the room thought about it. She had not changed in any fundamental way. The edges were more familiar now, was all. He knew which silences meant she was working and which meant she was troubled. He knew that she ran cold and needed the fire banked high in October, and that she had a specific response to being surprised that involved going very still and then usually saying something precise and dry that made him want to laugh. He knew she still occasionally wrote letters she didn't send. Not to Portland and Seattle anymore, not to accounting firms, but to her brother-in-law in Spokane, whom she'd decided she liked more than she'd expected, and to a woman she'd met in town 3 years back who'd moved away and written first, and to her aunt in Portland who was getting old, and to whom Iris sent careful, affectionate letters that were nothing like the way she talked in person, which she would never have admitted. He knew her the way you know a place you've lived in long enough that you stop seeing it freshly and start simply knowing it. The way his hands knew the mill equipment or his feet knew the West Road. Not the dramatic knowing of discovery, but the deep structural knowing of long familiarity. "Good morning's work," he said. "We'll see what they come back with." She picked up the folder. "How's the equipment assessment going?" "Secondary blade needs replacement before summer. I've been putting it off." "You've been putting it off since March." "I know when I've been putting things off." "Thomas asked me last night if he could come to the mill on Saturday," she said, the subject shift as natural as breathing. "He wants to see the equipment room." "I know, he told me too." "And?" I said yes. She looked at him with the expression she had when he'd said the right thing, and was mildly surprised to find it wasn't harder. "Good," she said simply. He went back to the floor. She went back to her office. Nora came back up from walking out Colton and stood in the corridor for a moment, looking between the 2 open doorways. Caleb's back visible through the floor window below, Iris already at her desk with a new page of numbers, and thought not for the first time about what it would have looked like if Iris had taken the Millhaven position. If she'd folded up that letter and sent it instead of putting it in her pocket. If Caleb had gone west on that second Wednesday instead of east, which had been the logical thing, and which he had not done. Nora had thought about that particular fork in the road more times than she'd ever told either of them, because she understood, in a way that only someone who'd watched it from close distance could fully understand, how many times the thing could have gone differently. How many moments there had been where either of them could have flinched and changed the course of it. She went back to her desk and opened the quarterly report and got back to work, which was what she did when she was feeling something she didn't have immediate language for. The day wound down the way days did. The shift ended, the floor cleared, the machinery went quiet piece by piece. Caleb finished the last of his assessments and wrote up the secondary blade replacement order. Overdue, Iris was right. She was usually right about the things she noted twice, and locked the equipment room. He went up to get his coat and found Iris still at her desk, which no longer surprised him the way it once had. He stood in the doorway. "Clara has a recital tonight," he said. Iris looked up with the expression of someone who has remembered something they had been trying to remember all day. "The school recital. What time?" "6. Doris Pelham told you last week, and you wrote it down, and then the Halverson thing happened." "I didn't forget it. You nearly forgot it." "Nearly is not the same as." She was already standing, gathering her things. "Does she know what she's playing?" "She told me last week. I didn't follow all of it." "She's been practicing the same piece for a month and a half. You've heard it every evening." Iris put on her coat. The dark green wool had been replaced 3 years ago with a heavier one, dark blue, lined, because she had never quite accepted Frost Creek winters without registering a protest, even after a decade of them. "I hear it," he said. "I don't always follow it." "She'll ask you what you thought." "I'll say it was good." "She'll want more than that. She's 9. Iris looked at him with the exasperation that was not really exasperation. "Pay attention tonight." "I always pay attention." "You pay attention to things with moving parts and load-bearing functions. Music has structure. Tell Clara that. Use those words specifically. She'll love it." The dry edge in her voice was fond rather than cutting, the kind of tone that had developed between them over years of knowing exactly how the other one was built. She picked up her bag. "Ready?" They went down together, out the front door, into the May evening that was neither fully warm nor cold, the light going long and golden the way it did in the good months, lying flat across the road and the mill's weathered exterior and the mountain face to the north. They walked west. It was not a Wednesday. It did not need to be. The West Road was just the road they took now, the ordinary direction of their ordinary life, and the old timber yard was just the timber yard, and the gap in the trees where the mountain showed through was just a familiar landmark, rather than a measure of how far they'd come. Clara was already on the porch when they came up the track, sitting on the railing, Caleb's railing, the one built on the wedding day, with her feet swinging and her school dress on, and an expression of barely contained impatience. "You're late," she announced. "We're exactly on time," Iris said. "I said 6 and you're not here at 6. You're here at 6 in 12 minutes. We're not late until we miss something," Caleb said. Clara considered this with the focused skepticism of a 9-year-old who suspected she was being managed. "Thomas is ready. He's been ready for an hour." "Thomas is 6, Iris said. "He's been ready because he doesn't understand that ready and on time are different things." "Well, someone should explain that to him because he keeps asking me when you're coming back and I kept having to say, 'Clara.'" Iris's voice was patient, specifically patient in the way that meant she was not actually irritated but was not going to let it run further. "Go get your brother." Clara jumped off the railing and went inside, volume undiminished, calling for Thomas with the authority of someone who had been the older sibling for 6 years and had fully inhabited the role. Caleb stood on the porch and looked at the fur stand in the evening light. The rope swing moved slightly in the air, which was barely moving. A woodpecker somewhere in the stand was working on something with the steady mechanical persistence of an animal that had found its purpose and was committing to it. Iris came to stand beside him, not touching, just beside him, the way they stood when they were waiting for something together. "She's going to be terrible tonight," he said. "She's going to be fine. She'll be distracted. She's been distracted all week. She'll play the piece she's practiced 40 times, and it will be fine, and you'll tell her it was good. And she'll want more than that, and you'll say something about structure, and she'll be satisfied." Iris looked at the swing. "Thomas is going to fall asleep in the second half." "Probably. You'll carry him home." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. The pecker in the fur stand kept at it. "Colton will come back with concessions," she said. "Halverson wants the 10-year relationship. They'll give on the capacity baseline." "You figured that out this afternoon." "I figured it out Tuesday night, actually. I just wanted to see how he presented it before I said anything." He looked at her sideways. "You knew before the meeting." "I had a strong theory." "You had a counter-proposal drafted before he sat down." Having a plan is not the same as being certain. She said it with the precision she applied to distinctions that mattered to her. "I had a plan." The meeting confirmed the plan was right. "There's a version of that would drive some people crazy," he said. "There's a version of you that could drive some people crazy too." She glanced at him. "You go silent for a week when something is on your mind and I have to pull it out of you like a bad tooth." "I'm better than I was." You are, she said. So am I. She said it the way she'd said it once before, years ago, in a different context, and he recognized it and thought she probably intended him to. The door opened and Thomas came out first, carefully, holding something, a drawing he'd apparently made and wanted to show them before they left. Clara came behind him with the resigned expression of someone who'd tried to hurry someone and failed. Thomas held up the drawing. It was a detailed and earnest rendering of the mill's main floor, viewed from above, with the equipment labeled in his 6-year-old handwriting, some of it recognizable, some of it invented phonetically. He had included the secondary blade with a note that said broken in large letters, which Caleb stared at for a moment. "How do you know about the secondary blade?" he asked. Thomas looked at him with his mother's eyes. "Pete said. Pete told you the secondary blade needs replacing. He said it's been broken since March, and you keep not fixing it." Thomas considered. "He said you put things off sometimes." Caleb looked at Iris. Iris looked at the sky with the expression of someone who was not going to comment on this. "Pete Dawes," Caleb said, to no one in particular. "He's nice," Thomas said simply, and folded his drawing and put it in his pocket with the finality of a child who has concluded the conversation. They walked to the schoolhouse. The recital was in the main room, 36 children in their good clothes, parents filling the chairs and the standing space along the walls. Pete was there with his wife, which surprised no one since Pete's youngest was in Clara's class. He caught Caleb's eye across the room and gave him the expression of a man who knew exactly what Thomas had said and was not remotely sorry about it. Caleb gave him a look that communicated several things without words, which Pete received cheerfully and ignored entirely. Clara played her piece. She was not terrible. She was nervous, which showed in her hands at the beginning, and she started one measure slightly ahead of the tempo and had to correct, which she did with a small sideways tilt of her head that was so purely her own that Caleb felt it somewhere under his sternum. Then she found her pace and played it through to the end and came off the stage with her chin up in the way she had when she'd done something hard and was not going to admit she'd been afraid. Afterward, she came directly to Caleb. "Well?" He thought about what Iris had said. "The structure was solid," he said. "The correction in the third measure was the right call. You found it, and you fixed it without stopping." Clara stared at him. "You know music has measures?" "Music has structure," he said. "I pay attention." She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was briefly and clearly Iris's expression. The recalibration, the adjusting of expectations. Then she smiled, the wide, unguarded smile that she hadn't yet learned to manage, and went to find her friends. Iris was beside him. He felt rather than saw her not quite smile. "Structure," she said quietly. "It worked." "It did." A pause. "You do pay attention to things that matter." He looked at her. She was watching Clara across the room, weaving through the crowd with the fearlessness that came from solid ground, and her expression was the one he'd seen develop over 10 years. Not the careful containment of a woman who'd learned not to expect things, but something different. Something that had grown slowly in the space where the old habit used to live, filling it in the way that new growth fills a cleared place, not all at once, not cleanly, but real. Thomas fell asleep in the second half, exactly as predicted, slumped against Caleb's arm with the complete unconsciousness of a small child who had used up his day entirely. Caleb carried him home through the spring dark, Thomas's weight easy and familiar on his shoulder, Clara walking ahead with a school friend who lived one road over, talking about something with great intensity. Iris walked beside him on the west road, and the night was quiet around them, and Frost Creek put out its lights one window at a time. At the point where the road forked, east toward what had once been Iris's direction and was now just the other direction, west toward the red door and the porch, and the fur stand. She did not pause. She had not paused at that fork for 10 years. She went west without breaking stride, the way you move through familiar space, the way the body remembers roads it has taken enough times that the choice is no longer a choice, but a simple fact of direction. This is the thing that nobody tells you about the life you build slowly, out of imperfect materials, with insufficient planning and too many silences and more than one moment where the whole thing could have gone a different way. Nobody tells you that at some point the weight of it stops feeling like weight. That the accumulation of ordinary days, unremarkable in themselves, becomes something with more structural integrity than anything you could have designed deliberately. that the cabin you built to last will hold 2 coffee cups instead of 1, and the road you walked alone for years will become the road you walk together, until the walking is done, and the wrong direction will become simply home. Caleb did not think all of this in so many words, walking west through Frost Creek with his son on his shoulder and his wife beside him. He was thinking about the secondary blade replacement, and about Halverson's likely counter to Iris's counter, and about the thing Thomas had said on the porch about Pete telling him things, which was going to require a conversation with Pete about the appropriate distribution of mill maintenance information to 6-year-olds. But some part of him knew it anyway, the way the body knows things that the mind is too busy to articulate. The west road under his feet, the warm weight of Thomas, the sound of Iris's boots on the packed earth, that familiar rhythm he could have identified without looking, the same way you recognize a piece of music you've heard enough times that it lives in you rather than around you. They got home. Clara's friend had peeled off 2 roads back. Caleb got Thomas into bed without waking him, which required the specific skill of moving a sleeping child through space that he'd developed over 6 years, and which he would never have claimed as a skill in front of other men, but which he was quietly proud of. Iris came in at the end to pull the blanket up and stood for a moment looking at him the way she sometimes did, directly, without the professional composure, without the calculation, just looking. "Good night, Thomas," she said quietly to the sleeping boy. They went back to the front room. The wood stove needed banking for the night. The coffee cups from that morning were still on the table, which neither of them had gotten around to washing. The cabin was warm and quiet and entirely itself, which was the only thing it had ever tried to be. Iris sat in her chair, the second chair, the one with the wool blanket on it that had come from the boarding house 10 years ago and was still there, worn soft with use, and picked up the letter she'd been writing to her aunt in Portland. She did not write immediately. She looked at the fire for a moment with an expression that he'd learned over time, meant she was content in a way she didn't entirely know what to do with, because contentment had not been her native state, and she was still, after a decade, occasionally surprised to find herself in it. He sat in his chair and looked at the fire too. After a while she said, "The porch railing has a loose post, the one on the east corner." "I know." "You've known since February." "I've known since February." "Baseline," she said, and went back to her letter. He leaned forward and put another piece of wood on the fire, and the cabin held its warmth around them, and outside Frost Creek went about the business of its evening, the mill silent at the end of the west road, the mountain standing over everything the way it always had, indifferent to the particular smallness of human lives and to the fact that smallness lived with honesty and care, and the willingness to walk in the wrong direction when the wrong direction is the right one. Smallness, it turned out, was more than enough. He would fix the east corner post on Saturday. He would not put it off again until March.